Welcome to Stories. I'm Sherry Neiman, and each week I will read you a short story written by a good writer. What is one of the first things a child asks for, looks forward to, and might have you repeat it over and over again? A story. Because stories tell us about who we are. They explain why we do what we do, whether it's good or bad, silly or sad. We need stories to entertain us. As Isaac Bashevis Singer said about writing, analysis of character is the highest form of human entertainment, and it does it, unlike gossip, without mentioning specific names. So, it's less malicious. If you like this podcast, please write a review. Even if you don't like it, go ahead and write a review. Thank you for listening. Stewart Edward White was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1873 to the son of a millionaire lumberman. He died September 18th, 1946 in San Francisco after an operation at the University of California Hospital. He was 73. He graduated with an MA from Columbia University. In 1904, he married in Santa Barbara, California, where his parents had a summer house since he was 11. Soon afterward, he met President Theodore Roosevelt, and they toured California together. He traveled a great deal and had a wide range of experiences. He was one of the first white men to explore Eastern Africa, which is present-day Tanzania. He mapped the area in 1913. He missed the Spanish-American War because he was living in Moose Factory, Northern Ontario, on Hudson's Bay, where a ship stopped by only once a year. In 1918, he and his wife attended a party where a Ouija board was brought out. They both became committed spiritualists after that, and he supposedly communicated with her after her death in 1939. More than a dozen of his stories about the Old West were adapted to television and movies, the latest being the 2018 movie The Ballad of Buster Scruggs by the Coen brothers. The Ballad of Buster Scruggs was named one of the top 10 movies of 2018. It also earned 3 Academy Award nominations. It is a series of 6 stories from the Old West, The Girl Who Got Rattled being the longest. Stewart White said that he never went anywhere looking for material. He went somewhere because it attracted him, and later, if he found something to write about it, he did. A spoiled young lady loses her nerve way out there on the plains during an annual trip with her father. And now, without further ado, here is The Girl Who Got Rattled by Stewart Edward White. This is one of the stories of Alfred. There are many of them still floating around the West, for Alfred was in his time very well known. He was a little man, and he was bashful. That is the most that can be said against him. But he was very little and very bashful. When on horseback, his legs hardly reached the lower body line of his mount, and only his extreme agility enabled him to get on successfully. When on foot, strangers were inclined to call him Sonny. In company, he never advanced an opinion. If things did not go according to his ideas, he reconstructed the ideas and made the best of it. Only he could make the most efficient best of the poorest ideas of any man on the plains. His attitude was a perpetual, sidling apology. It has been said that Alfred killed his men diffidently, without enthusiasm, as though loath to take the responsibility. And this, in the pioneer days on the plains, was either frivolous affectation or else Alfred. With women he was lost. Men would have staked their last ounce of dust at odds that he had never in his life made a definite assertion of fact to one of the opposite sex. When it became absolutely necessary to change a woman's preconceived notions as to what she should do, as, for instance, discouraging her riding through quicksand, he would persuade somebody else to issue the advice, and he would cower in the background, blushing his absurd little blushes at his second-hand temerity. Add to this narrow, sloping shoulders, a soft voice, and a diminutive pink and white face. But Alfred could read the prairie like a book. He could ride anything, shoot accurately, was at heart afraid of nothing, and could fight like a little catamount when occasion for it really arose. Among those who knew, Alfred was considered one of the best scouts on the plains. That is why Caldwell the capitalist engaged him when he took his daughter out to Deadwood. Miss Caldwell was determined to go to Deadwood, a limited experience of the ladies' sort, where they have wooden floors to the tents, towels to the tent poles, and expert cooks to the delectation of the campers, had convinced her that roughing it was her favorite recreation. So, of course, Caldwell Sr. had, sooner or later, to take her across the plains on his annual trip. This was at the time when wagon trains went by way of Pierre on the north and the South Fork on the south. Incidental Indians of homicidal tendencies and undeveloped ideas as to the propriety of doing what they were told made things interesting occasionally, but not often. There was really no danger to a good-sized train. The daughter had a fiancé named Alan, who liked roughing it too, so he went along. He and Miss Caldwell rigged themselves out bountifully and prepared to enjoy the trip. At Pierre, the train of 8 wagons was made up, and they were joined by Alfred and Billy Knapp. These 2 men were interesting, but tyrannical on 1 or 2 points, such as getting out of sight of the train, for instance. They were also deficient in reasons for their tyranny. The young people chafed, and, finding Billy Knapp either imperturbable or thick-skinned, they turned their attention to Alfred. Alan annoyed Alfred, and Miss Caldwell thoughtlessly approved of Alan. Between them, they succeeded often in shocking fearfully all the little man's finer sensibilities. If it had been a question of Alan alone, the annoyance would soon have ceased. Alfred would simply have bashfully killed him. But because of his innate courtesy, which so saturated him that his philosophy of life was thoroughly tinged by it, he was silent and inactive. There is a great deal to recommend a plains journey at first. Later, there is nothing at all to recommend it. It has the same monotony as a voyage at sea, only there is less living room, and instead of being carried, you must progress to a great extent by your own volition. Also, the food is coarse, the water poor, and you cannot bathe. To a plainsman, or a man who has the instinct, these things are as nothing in comparison with the charm of the outdoor life, and the pleasing tingling of adventure. But woman is a creature wedded to comfort. She also has a strange instinctive desire to be entirely alone every once in a while, probably because her experiences, while not less numerous than man's, are mainly psychical, and she needs occasionally time to get, quote, thought up to date, unquote. So Miss Caldwell began to get very impatient. The afternoon of the 6th day, Alfred, Miss Caldwell, and Alan rode along side by side. Alfred was telling a self-effacing story of adventure, and Miss Caldwell was listening carelessly because she had nothing else to do. Alan chafed lazily when the fancy took him. "I happened to have a limb broken at the time." Alfred was observing parenthetically in his soft tones. "And so—" "What kind of a limb?" asked the young Easterner, with direct brutality. He glanced with a half-humorous aside at the girl, to whom the little man had been mainly addressing himself. Alfred hesitated, blushed, lost the thread of his tale, and finally, in great confusion, reined back his horse by the harsh Spanish bit. He fell to the rear of the little wagon train, where he hung his head and went hot and cold by turns in thinking of such an indiscretion before a lady. The young Easterner spurred up on the right of the girl's mount. "He's the queerest little fellow I ever saw," he observed with a laugh. "Sorry to spoil his story. Was it a good one?" "It might have been, if you hadn't spoiled it," answered the girl, flicking her horse's ears mischievously. The animal danced. "What did you do it for?" "Oh, just to see him squirm. He'll think about that all the rest of the afternoon, and will hardly dare look at you in the face next time you meet." "I know. Isn't he funny? The other morning, he came around the corner of the wagon and caught me with my hair down. I wish you could have seen him." She laughed gaily at the memory. "Let's get ahead of the dust," she suggested. They drew aside to the firm turf of the prairie and put their horses to a slow lope. Once well ahead of the canvas-covered schooners, they slowed down to a walk again. "Alfred says we'll see them tomorrow," said the girl. "See what?" "Why, the hills. They'll show like a dark streak down past that butte there. What's its name?" "Porcupine Trail?" "Oh, yes. And after that, it's only 3 days. Are you glad?" "Are you?" "Yes, I believe I am. This life is fun at first, but there's a certain monotony in making your toilet where you have to duck your head because you haven't room to raise your hands. And this barreled water palls after a time. I think I'll be glad to see a house again. People like camping about so long." "It hasn't gone back on me yet." "Well, you're a man and can do things." "Can't you do things?" "You know I can't. What do you suppose they'd say if I were to ride out just that way for 2 miles? They'd have a fit." "Who'd have a fit?" "Nobody but Alfred. And I didn't know you'd gotten afraid of him yet." "I say, just let's. We'll have a race and then come right back." The young man looked boyishly eager. "It would be nice," she mused. They gazed into each other's eyes like a pair of children and laughed. "Why shouldn't we?" urged the young man. "I'm dead sick of staying in the moving circle of these confounded wagons. What's the sense of it all, anyway?" "Why, Indians, I suppose," said the girl doubtfully. "Indians?" he replied with contempt. "Indians! We haven't seen a sign of one since we left Pierre. I don't believe there's one in the whole blasted country. Besides, you know what Alfred said at our last camp." "What did Alfred say?" "Alfred said he hadn't seen even a teepee trail, and that they must be all up hunting buffalo. Besides that, you don't imagine for a moment that your father would take you all this way to Deadwood just for a lark, if there was the slightest danger, do you?" "I don't know. I made him." She looked out over the long, sweeping descent to which they were coming, and the long, sweeping ascent that lay beyond. The breeze and the sun played with the prairie grasses, the breeze riffling them over, and the sun silvering their undersurfaces thus exposed. It was strangely peaceful, and one almost expected to hear the hum of bees, as in a New England orchard. In it all was no sign of life. "We'd get lost," she said, finally. "Oh, no, we wouldn't," he asserted with all the eagerness of the amateur plainsman. "I've got that all figured out. You see, our train is going on a line with that butte behind us and the sun. So, if we go ahead and keep our shadows just pointing to the butte, we'll be right in their line of march." He looked to her for admiration of his cleverness. She seemed convinced. She agreed, and sent him back to her wagon for some article of invented necessity. While he was gone, she slipped softly over the little hill to the right, cantered rapidly over 2 more, and slowed down with a sigh of satisfaction. One alone could watch the directing shadow as well as 2. She was free and alone. It was the one thing she had desired for the last 6 days of the long plains journey, and she enjoyed it now to the full. No one had seen her go. The drivers droned stupidly along, as was their wont. The occupants of the wagons slept, as was their wont, and the diminutive Alfred was hiding his blushes behind clouds of dust in the rear, as was not his wont at all. He had been severely shocked, and he might have brooded over it all the afternoon, if a discovery had not startled him to activity. On a bare spot of the prairie, he discerned the print of a hoof. It was not that of one of the train's animals. Alfred knew this, because just to one side of it, caught under a grass blade, so cunningly that only the little scout's eyes could have discerned it at all, was a single blue bead. Alfred rode out on the prairie to the right and to the left, and found the hoofprints of about 30 ponies. He pushed his hat back and wrinkled his brow, for the one thing he was looking for he could not find: the 2 narrow furrows made by the ends of teepee poles, dragging along on either side of the ponies. The absence of these indicated that the band was composed entirely of bucks, and bucks were likely to mean mischief. He pushed ahead of the whole party, his eyes fixed earnestly on the ground. At the top of the hill he encountered the young Easterner. The latter looked puzzled in a half-humorous way. "I left Miss Caldwell here a half-minute ago," he observed to Alfred, "and I guess she's given me the slip. Scold her good for me when she comes in, will you?" He grinned with good-natured malice at the idea of Alfred scolding anyone. Then Alfred surprised him. The little man straightened suddenly in his saddle and uttered a fervent curse. After a brief circle about the prairie, he returned to the young man. "You go back to the wagons and wake up Billy Knapp, and tell him this, that I've gone scouting some and I want him to watch out. Understand? Watch out!" "What?" began the Easterner, bewildered. "I'm a-going to find her," said the little man decidedly. "You don't think there's any danger, do you?" asked the Easterner in anxious tones. "Can't I help you?" "You do as I tell you. replied the little man shortly, and rode away. He followed Miss Caldwell's trail quite rapidly, for the trail was fresh. As long as he looked intently for hoof marks, nothing was to be seen. The prairie was apparently virgin. But by glancing the eye 40 or 50 yards ahead, a faint line was discernible through the grasses. Alfred came upon Miss Caldwell seated quietly on her horse in the very center of a prairie dog town, and so, of course, in the midst of an area of comparatively desert character. She was amusing herself by watching the marmots as they barked, or watched or peeped at her, according to their distance from her. The sight of Alfred was not welcome, for he frightened the marmots. When he saw Miss Caldwell, Alfred grew bashful again. He sidled his horse up to her and blushed. "I'll show you the way back, miss," he said, diffidently. "Thank you," replied Miss Caldwell, with a slight coldness. "I can find my own way back." "Yes, of course," hastened Alfred, in an agony. "But don't you think we ought to start back now? I'd like to go with you, miss, if you'd let me. You see, the afternoon's quite late." Miss Caldwell cast a quizzical eye at the sun. "Why, it's hours yet till dark," she said amusedly. Then Alfred surprised Miss Caldwell. His diffident manner suddenly left him. He jumped like lightning from his horse, threw the reins over the animal's head so he would stand, and ran around to face Miss Caldwell. "Here, jump down," he commanded. The soft southern burr of his ordinary conversation had given place to a clear incisiveness. Miss Caldwell looked at him, amazed. Seeing that she did not at once obey, Alfred actually began to fumble hastily with the straps that held her riding skirt in place. This was so unusual in the bashful Alfred that Miss Caldwell roused and slipped lightly to the ground. "Now what?" she asked. Alfred, without replying, drew the bit to within a few inches of the animal's hoofs, and tied both fetlocks firmly together with the double loop. This brought the pony's nose down close to his shackled feet. Then he did the same thing with his own beast. Thus, neither animal could so much as hobble one way or the other. They were securely moored. Alfred stepped a few paces to the eastward. Miss Caldwell followed. "Sit down," said he. Miss Caldwell obeyed with some nervousness. She did not understand at all, and that made her afraid. She began to have a dim fear lest Alfred might have gone crazy. His next move strengthened this suspicion. He walked away 10 feet and raised his hand over his head, palm forward. She watched him so intently that for a moment she saw nothing else. Then she followed the direction of his gaze and uttered a little sobbing cry. Just below the skyline of the first slope to eastward was silhouetted a figure on horseback. The figure on horseback sat motionless. "We're in for a fight," said Alfred, coming back after a moment. "He won't understand my peace sign, and he's a Sioux. We can't make a run for it through this dog town. We've just got to stand him off." He threw down and back the lever of his old .44 Winchester and softly uncocked the arm. Then he sat down by Miss Caldwell. From various directions, silently, warriors on horseback sprang into sight and moved dignifiedly toward the first comer, forming at the last a band of perhaps 30 men. They talked together for a moment, and then, one by one, at regular intervals, detached themselves and began circling at full speed to the left, throwing themselves behind their horses and yelling shrill-voiced, but firing no shot as yet. "They'll rush us," speculated Alfred. We're too few to monkey with this way. This is a bluff." The circle about the two was now complete. After watching the whirl of figures a few minutes and the motionless landscape beyond, the eye became dizzied and confused. "They won't have no picnic," went on Alfred with a little chuckle. "Dog holes as bad for them as for us. They don't know how to fight. If they was to come in on all sides, I couldn't handle 'em, but they always rush in a bunch like damn fools." And then Alfred became suffused with blushes and commenced to apologize abjectly and profusely to a girl who had heard neither the word nor its atonement. The savages and the approaching fight were all she could think of. Suddenly, one of the Sioux threw himself forward under his horse's neck and fired. The bullet went wild, of course, but it shrieked with the rising inflection of a wind squall through bared boughs, seeming to come ever nearer. Miss Caldwell screamed and covered her face. The savages yelled in chorus. The one shot seemed to be the signal for a spattering fire all along the line. Indians never clean their rifles, rarely get good ammunition, and are deficient in the philosophy of hindsights. Besides this, it is not easy to shoot at long range in a constrained position from a running horse. Alfred watched them contemptuously in silence. "If they keep that up long enough, the wagon train may hear 'em," he said finally. "Wish we weren't so far to the north. There, it's a-comin'," he said more excitedly. The chief had paused, and as the warriors came to him, they threw their ponies back on their haunches and sat motionless. They turned the ponies' heads toward the two. Alfred arose deliberately for a better look. "Yes, that's right," he said to himself. "That's old Lone Pine, sure thing. I reckon we all's got to make a good fight." The girl had sunk to the ground and was shaking from head to foot. It is not nice to be shot at in the best of circumstances, but to be shot at by odds of 30-1, and the 30 of an outlandish and terrifying species, is not nice at all. Miss Caldwell had gone to pieces badly, and Alfred looked grave. He thoughtfully drew from his holster his beautiful Colt's with its ivory handle and laid it on the grass. Then he blushed, hot and cold, and looked at the girl doubtfully. A sudden movement in the group of savages, as the war chief rode to the front, decided him. "Miss Caldwell," he said. The girl shivered and moaned. Alfred dropped to his knees and shook her shoulder roughly. "Look up here," he commanded. "We ain't got but a minute." Composed a little by the firmness of his tone, she sat up. Her face had gone chalky, and her hair had partly fallen over her eyes. "Now listen to every word," he said rapidly. "Those Injuns is goin' to rush us in a minute. P'raps I can break 'em, but I don't know. In that pistol there, I always save 2 shots. Understand? It's always loaded. If I see it's all up, I'm a-goin' to shoot you with one of 'em and myself with the other." "Oh!" cried the girl, her eyes opening wildly. She was paying close attention enough now. "And if they kill me first," he reached forward and seized her wrist impressively. "If they kill me first, you must take that pistol and shoot yourself. Understand? Shoot yourself. In the head. Here." He tapped his forehead with his stubby forefinger. The girl shrank back in horror. Alfred snapped his teeth together and went on grimly. "If they get hold of you," he said with solemnity, "they'll first take off every stitch of your clothes, and when you're quite naked, they'll stretch you out on the ground with a rawhide to each of your arms and legs, and then they'll drive a stake through the middle of your body into the ground and leave you there to die slowly." And the girl believed him because, incongruously enough, even through her terror, she noticed that at this, the most immodest speech of his life, Alfred did not blush. She looked at the pistol lying on the turf with horrified fascination. The group of Indians, which had up to now remained fully 1,000 yards away, suddenly screeched and broke into a run directly toward the dog town. There is an indescribable rush in a charge of savages. The little ponies make their feet go so fast, the feathers and trappings of the warriors stream behind so frantically, the whole attitude of horse and man is so eager that one gets an impression of fearful speed and resistless power. The horizon seems full of Indians. As if this were not sufficiently terrifying, the air is throbbing with sound. Each Indian pops away for general results as he comes jumping along and yells shrilly to show what a big warrior he is, while underneath it all is the hurried monotone of hoofbeats becoming ever louder as the roar of an increasing rainstorm on the roof. It does not seem possible that anything can stop them. Yet there is one thing that can stop them, if skillfully taken advantage of, and that is their lack of discipline. An Indian will fight hard when cornered or when heated by lively resistance, but he hates to go into it in cold blood. As he nears the opposing rifle, the feeling gets stronger. So often a man with nerve enough to hold his fire can break a fierce charge merely by waiting until it is within 50 yards or so, and then suddenly raising the muzzle of his gun. If he had gone to shooting at once, the affair would have become a combat, and the Indians would have ridden him down. As it is, each has had time to think. By the time the white man is ready to shoot, the suspense has done its work. Each savage knows that but one will fall, but, cold-blooded, he does not want to be that one. And since in such disciplined fighters it is each for himself, he promptly ducks beneath his mount and circles away to the right or the left. The whole band swoops and divides, like a flock of swift-winged terns on a windy day. This Alfred relied on in the approaching crisis. The girl watched the wild sweep of the warriors with strained eyes. She had to grasp her wrist firmly to keep from fainting, and she seemed incapable of thought. Alfred sat motionless on a dog mound, his rifle across his lap. He did not seem in the least disturbed. "It's good to fight again," he murmured, gently fondling the stock of his rifle. "Come on, ye devils! Aha!" he cried as a warrior's horse went down in a dog hole. "I thought so." His eyes began to shine. The ponies came skipping here and there, nimbly dodging in and out between the dog holes. Their riders shot and yelled wildly, but none of the bullets went lower than 10 feet. The circle of their advance looked somehow like the surge shoreward of a great wave, and the similarity was heightened by the nodding glimpses of the light eagle's feathers in their hair. The run across the honeycombed plain was hazardous, even to Indian ponies, and 3 went down kicking, one after the other. 2 of the riders lay stunned. The 3rd sat up and began to rub his knee. The pony belonging to Miss Caldwell became frightened, threw itself and lay on its side, kicking out frantically with its hind legs. At the proper moment, Alfred cocked his rifle and rose swiftly to his knees. As he did so, the mound on which he had been kneeling caved into the hole beneath it and threw him forward on his face. With a furious curse, he sprang to his feet and leveled his rifle at the thick of the press. The scheme worked. In a flash, every savage disappeared behind his pony, and nothing was to be seen but an arm and a leg. The band divided on either hand as promptly as though the signal for such a drill had been given, and swept gracefully around in 2 long circles until it reined up, motionless, at nearly the exact point from which it had started on its imposing charge. Alfred had not fired a shot. He turned to the girl with a short laugh. She lay face upward on the ground, staring at the sky with wide-open, horror-stricken eyes. In her brow was a small blackened hole, and under her head, which lay strangely flat against the earth, the grasses had turned red. Near her hand lay the heavy Colt's .44. Alfred looked at her for a moment, without winking. Then he nodded his head. "It was 'cause I fell down that hole. She thought they'd got me," he said aloud to himself. "Poor little gal. She hadn't ought to have did it." He blushed deeply and, turning his face away, pulled down her skirt until it covered her ankles. Then he picked up his Winchester and fired 3 shots. The first hit directly back of the ear of one of the stunned Indians, who had fallen with his horse. The second went through the other stunned Indian's chest. The third caught the Indian with the broken leg between the shoulders, just as he tried to get behind his struggling pony. Shortly after, Billy Knapp and the wagon train came along. I hope you enjoyed The Girl Who Got Rattled by Stuart Edward White. May you always find a good book to read, and may all your stories end well.